Shalom. I'm Eddie Chumney of Hebraic Heritage Ministries, and we welcome you to the Hebraic Heritage Ministries Yeshiva Discipleship Program. In this teaching, we're going to be sharing with you on the subject of the 7,000-year plan of the God of Israel. And in this teaching, we're going to be sharing with you the following principles. To begin with, we're going to see that 7 days of creation as given to us in Genesis chapter 1 and then continuing into Genesis chapter 2, 1 through 3, that each day in creation is prophetic of 1,000 years of time. And we're told this in Psalm chapter 90 and verse 4, which is quoted in 2 Peter chapter 3 and verse 8. So that being the case, we're going to see that from the creation of Adam in the garden until the coming of Yeshua was 4,000 years of time. And then there's an additional 2,000 years of time that are associated with what we call the present age. So the present age is 6,000 years in time. And after the 6,000 years of the present age, then we're going to have the 1,000 years, commonly called the Messianic Era, where Yeshua is going to rule and reign on the earth, setting up his kingdom and teaching the Torah to all nations from Jerusalem. And so what we're going to do in the first part of the teaching is we're going to look at some biblical chronologies so that we can establish that there is a biblical validity that from Adam and Eve in the garden until the first coming of Yeshua was 4,000 years of time. And so we've gone 2,000 years since. And the 1,000-year Messianic era, where Yeshua is going to rule and reign on the earth, this is going to correspond with the seventh day of creation. So the seventh day of creation, which is prophetic of 1,000 years of time, the fulfillment of that being the prophetic Sabbath of creation, is going to correspond to the 1,000-year Messianic era. So the Sabbath is called the day of the Lord. We see this in Isaiah chapter 58 and verse 13. Therefore, the prophetic Sabbath, that is the 1,000-year Messianic era, the biblical term for it is going to be the day of the Lord. So at the end of the teaching, we're going to look at what the Bible says is going to happen in the day of the Lord, but we're going to see that in Genesis, in speaking of the days of creation, it's going to say, and evening and morning was the first day, and evening and morning was the second day. So a biblical day begins in the evening and it ends in the morning. Therefore, the prophetic Sabbath, that is the day of the Lord, that it is going to begin in darkness, and we commonly call that period of darkness as the tribulation period. The darkness period is going to end when Yeshua sets his feet down on the Mount of Olives, and then that will begin a period of time as being light. And the Torah is called light. In Proverbs chapter 6 and verse 23, it says, the commandment is a lamp and the Torah is light. And in Isaiah in chapter 2 and verse 5, Jacob is being told to walk in the light of the Lord. That is, to follow the Torah. So after we look at the biblical chronologies, and we're going to be looking at several biblical chronologies. Now, in doing so, particularly when we're looking at from Adam and Eve in the garden to Yeshua's first coming, which I'm going to show is roughly 4,000 years of time, the purpose in showing you the various chronologies is to not to try to exactly arrive at 4,000 years from Adam and Eve in the garden to Yeshua's first coming, but to show the validity of the understanding that there is 4,000 years from Adam and Eve in the garden to the first coming of Yeshua. And then what we're going to do is we are going to look at prophetic pictures in the scriptures of 6,000 years of time of the present era before we go into a 1,000-year period of rest for man and the earth, which we commonly call the Messianic Era. So that's an overview of what we're going to be covering in this teaching. So let's begin to look at each aspect of this teaching in its detail. To begin with, we need to understand a very important biblical principle, particularly in understanding Bible prophecy, and that is the end is told in the beginning. We can see this from Isaiah chapter 46 and verses 9 through 11, where it is written, "Remember the former things of old, for I am God and there is none else. I am God and there is none like me." So that verse is making the statement or making the claim that there is nobody like the God of Israel. In what way and in what context? Well, here it's in the context of verse 10, which says, declaring the end, that is the future, from the beginning, and from ancient times, that's the past, the things that are not yet done, that's the future, saying, my counsel, and what's his counsel? To declare the end from the beginning. My counsel will stand, and I will do all my pleasure. Now, at the end of Isaiah chapter 46, verse 11, it says, I have spoken it. When? In the beginning. I will also bring it to pass. When? In the end. I purposed it. When? In the beginning. I will also do it. When? In the future. So, next, we're going to continue to see this principle from Ecclesiastes in chapter 1 and verse 9, as it is written. The thing that has been, that's the past, is that which shall be, that's the future. And that which is done is that which shall be done, because there is no new thing under the sun. You've probably heard it said at one time that history repeats itself. So even in our secular world, it's understood that history tends to go in cycles. So that's how God made the world and made the creation, that it would go in cycles, and the God of Israel established what will be in the beginning. Now we can see this from Ecclesiastes chapter 3 and verse 15, as it is written, that which has been, that's the past, is now. And that which is to be, that's the future, has already been, that's the past. Because God requires in the future that which happened in the past. So we can see from these scriptures how we come to the understanding that biblical history is prophecy. Now we're going to see that in the Bible that a day is likened to 1,000 years. We can see this from Psalm chapter 90 verse 4, as it is written, for 1,000 years in your sight are but as yesterday, which is a day, when it is past, and as a watch in the night. Now Psalm chapter 90 in verse 4 is quoted in the New Testament in 2 Peter chapter 3 and verse 8, as it is written, Beloved, be not ignorant of this one thing. Don't be ignorant of what? Don't be ignorant that one day is with the Lord as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years as one day. So this is how we can establish the principle that each day in creation is prophetic of 1,000 years of time. Now, this is also the Jewish understanding of time, that each day in creation represents 1,000 years. So I'm going to be sharing with you now from the commentary on the Torah from Moses Nachmanides to the book of Genesis, where he states the following. The 6 days of creation represent all the days of the world. That is that its existence in the present era will be 6,000 years. And for this reason, the rabbis have said, now he's quoting Psalm chapter 90 and verse 4, a day of the Holy One, blessed be he, is 1,000 years. So now the next thing that we're going to is that it's not only a Jewish understanding that each day in creation represents 1,000 years, and that from the creation of Adam and Eve in the garden to the completion of time as it was established in the creation for man and the earth being 7,000 years, but this was also the understanding by the early church. So I'm going to share with you some examples of this. The first one comes from the extra biblical book of Barnabas, chapter 13 and verses 3 through 6, from a book that's called The Lost Books of the Bible. So now, Barnabas chapter 13 verses 3 through 6 says, and even in the beginning of the creation he makes mention of the Sabbath. And God made in 6 days the works of his hands, and he finished them on the seventh day, and he rested the seventh day and sanctified it. Consider, my children, what this means. He finished them in 6 days. The meaning of it is this, that in 6,000 years the Lord God will bring all things to an end. For with him 1 day is 1,000 years, as he himself testifies, saying, behold, this day shall be 1,000 years. Therefore, children, in 6 days, that is 6,000 years, shall all things be accomplished. And what does it mean when it says, and he rested on the seventh day? He means this, that when his son, that's a reference to Yeshua the Messiah, will come and abolish the season of the wicked one and judge the ungodly and change the sun and the moon and the stars. That's the judgment of the nations as outlined in the book of Revelation, as well as the prophets like Jeremiah and Isaiah, etc. Then he shall gloriously rest, that is Yeshua setting up his Messianic kingdom for 1,000 years, in that seventh day. That is the prophetic seventh day of creation. So next, we're going to look at the writings of a church father known as Irenaeus. And he lived about 150 AD. Now, Irenaeus was trained by Polycarp, who was trained by John, the disciple of Yeshua, who wrote the book of Revelation. So this comes from Irenaeus' work Against Heresies, book 5, chapter 28, verse 3, where he says, for in as many days as this world was made, in so many thousand years shall it be concluded. That is an account of the things formerly created, as also it is a prophecy of what is to come. For the day of the Lord is as 1,000 years, and in 6 days created things were completed. It is evident, therefore, that they will come to an end at the 6,000th year. So we can see, as I shared with you from the Torah commentary of Moses Nachmanides, the Ramban, as well as writings in the 1st and 2nd century that are associated with Christian works, the Epistle of Barnabas and Irenaeus' work Against Heresies, that there was an understanding that the 7 days of creation is prophetic of 7,000 years of time. So now we're going to look at this principle from the Jewish understanding from the Talmud in Sanhedrin 97a, as it is written. Rabbi Cana said, 6,000 years shall the world exist, and 1,000-year period, that would be the seventh, it shall be desolate, as it says in Isaiah chapter 2 verse 11, and the Lord alone will be exalted in that day. Abiah said it will be desolate 2,000 years, as it says in Hosea chapter 6 verse 2, after 2 days he will revive us, in the third day he will raise us up, and we shall live in his sight. The Tana, Debbie Eliyahu, teaches the world is to exist for 6,000 years. The first 2,000 years there was desolation. The next 2,000 years the Torah flourished. And the next 2,000 years is known as the days of the Messiah in Jewish understanding of time, in Jewish eschatology. So now on this slide, I'm going to show you then Jewish eschatology, the Jewish understanding of time. So we can see the first 2,000 years is called Tohu, which means desolation. The next 2,000 years is the time where the Torah was given, so the Torah flourished. And then after 4,000 years, Messiah is to come. So given that Messiah was to come after 4,000 years in the Jewish teaching and understanding, the days following the Messiah are called the days of the Messiah. And then the 1 day of Sabbath rest for man and the earth, what Christians commonly call the Messianic Era, is called in the Jewish understanding of time the Atid Lavo, which means the future coming. The next thing that we're going to do is I'm going to show you a prophetic hint in the Hebrew of 6,000 years to this present age. That would be followed by the 1,000-year Messianic Era. And we're going to understand this from Genesis chapter 1:1, where in the English it says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. In Hebrew, it is Breshit bara Elohim et hashamayim va'et haaretz. So in the Hebrew, to Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, there is going to be an occurrence of 6 ALEFs. Now, ALEF is the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet. So given that there are 6 ALEFs in Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, in the Hebrew, we are going to now understand from the Jewish understanding what is the meaning of the Hebrew letter ALEF. And this comes from the book, The Wisdom in the Hebrew Alphabet by Rabbi Michael Monk on page 43, where he says, the ALEF symbolizes the one and only, the eternal, the omnipotent God. So in the Jewish understanding, the Hebrew letter ALEF represents God. And now from the same book, The Wisdom of the Hebrew Alphabet by Rabbi Michael Monk on page 44, he continues to explain how the ALEF is going to be associated with the God of Israel, where he says when you write the Hebrew letter ALEF in block form, that the graphic form of the ALEF symbolizes the infinite, eternal nature of God. So when you write the ALEF in block form, it has 3 different parts. The upper right segment of the ALEF, it resembles or it looks like the Hebrew letter Yod. Its lower left segment also is a Hebrew letter Yod, and these 2 letters are connected by a diagonal Vav. Now, in the Hebrew alphabet, the Yod is the 10th letter of the alphabet, and it has a numerical value of 10 because every Hebrew letter has a numerical value. So the ALEF, the first letter, has a numerical value of 1. Yod, the 10th letter, has a numerical value of 10. So as we write the ALEF in block form, the upper and the lower segment of forming the letter is going to correspond to 2 Yods. The Yod has a numerical value of 10, so there's 2 Yods, so that would add up to 20. The Vav has a numerical value of 6. So if we take 20 plus 6, the ALEF in block form is represented by the number 26. So what's the significance of the number 26? It corresponds to the holy name of God in Hebrew, which we would say in English most commonly. It is pronounced Yahweh, but the Hebrew letters is Yod, He, Vav, He. So Yod is 10, He is 5, Vav is 6, and He is 5. So Yod, He, Vav, He is 10 plus 5 plus 6 plus 5, which equals 26. So this is another way that the Aleph is associated with the God of Israel, as the formation in its block form can be seen as two Alephes and a Vav, and that would have a numerical value of 26, which is the numerical value of Yod He Vav He. In addition, Rabbi Monk writes in the Wisdom of the Hebrew Alphabet on page 45 that the Aleph represents divinity. Now, one of the names of the God of Israel is Elohim. So Elohim is most commonly translated in our Bibles as God. And Elohim begins with an Aleph. And Elohim is associated with God's attribute of judgment. So now, since we see that the Aleph is associated with the God of Israel, and given that there are 6 Alephs in Genesis chapter 1 verse 1 in the Hebrew, that each Aleph is going to correspond with 1,000 years of time. So there's a hidden meaning that in the creation, when he created the heavens and the earth, that it's going to be for 6,000 years of time. And examining those 6,000 years of time, we are going to now give you a link to the Aleph being associated with the God of Israel. Because you can see in Genesis chapter 1 verse 1 that the first 2 occurrences of the Aleph, that it's the 3rd letter in Breshit and it's the 3rd letter in Bara. So this is going to correspond that it was in the first 2,000 years that the people on the earth built the Tower of Babel, and they were so wicked and evil that they were destroyed by the flood. And this is associated with the people of the earth being the farthest away from the God of Israel in relationship to him. And the first 2 Alephs are going to be associated with the first 2,000 years of time. In the next 2 occurrences in Genesis chapter 1 verse 1 of the Hebrew letter Aleph, it is the first letter in the 3rd word of Genesis chapter 1 verse 1, which is Elohim, and it's the first letter in the 4th word Et. And this is going to correspond with the people on the earth being closest to the God of Israel, and particularly his Torah. So these 2 occurrences of the Aleph is going to be associated with the second 2,000 years of time. And now finally, we're going to look at the last 2 Alephs in Genesis chapter 1 verse 1, and we can see that the first Aleph is the 2nd letter in the word Ve'et, and it's the 2nd letter in the word Haaretz. And so this is going to correspond when there's a spiritual battle and conflict going on among the peoples of the earth, particularly in the Western nations, where there's going to be those who's going to push for secular humanism and being away from the God of Israel and his ways, where there's going to be another group of people on the earth that is trying to pursue following the God of Israel and his ways. So the 2 Alephs being the 2nd letter of the last 2 words in Genesis 1:1 is going to represent this conflict. The next thing we're going to see is it's the Jewish understanding that the Messiah should come after 4,000 years from Adam and Eve in the garden. We can see this in the Talmud from Sanhedrin 97a and b, as it says, the Tana Debi Eliyahu teaches, the world is to exist 6,000 years. The first 2,000 years, there was desolation. 2,000 years, the Torah flourished. In the next 2,000 years is the days of the Messiah, where here it's called the Messianic Era. And then the commentary in the Talmud is that the Messiah is to come within that period. But the Talmud comments, in not believing that Yeshua is the Messiah, that through our many sins or iniquities, all these years have been lost. And the comment in the Talmud is that the Messiah should have come at the beginning of the last 2,000 years. his delay in coming, because they don't believe that Yeshua is the Messiah, is due to our sins. So therefore you can see here that the Jewish understanding is the Messiah should come after 4,000 years from Adam and Eve in the garden. So that being the case, you should be able to understand, therefore, that in the last 2,000 years, the highest expectation among the Jewish people as a corporate people for the coming of the Messiah was in the first century. So I'm going to share with you a quote from the Jewish newspaper called the Jewish Press. And this is published out of Brooklyn, New York. So in an article entitled The Coming of the Messiah, written by Rabbi Shalom Kloss, he explained that there was a high Jewish expectation in the first century for a personal Messiah. He writes in the article, the belief in a personal Messiah reached its highest tension during that period of the first century when Rome sent her despotic procurators to rule over Judea. The yoke was most oppressive, and the Jews awaited a leader whom God would send to articulate their latent spirit of rebellion and free them from the Roman tyranny. So from here you can see that there was a high Jewish expectation for the coming of the Messiah in the first century after 4,000 years from Adam and Eve in the garden. Of course, we believing that Yeshua is the Messiah, he did arrive at the time of the Jewish expectation. So now the next thing we're going to do is I'm going to share with you several biblical chronology studies. The purpose of me showing you these chronologies is not to try to examine all the details of biblical chronology and try to resolve and explain all the things that happen in the different periods of time where in various chronologies there's a difference of viewpoint. But instead, the purpose of showing you these different biblical chronologies is to establish that there is a biblical validity that from Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden to the time of the first century, that there had been approximately 4,000 years of time. So now let's begin to understand that in its detail. To begin with, we're going to examine biblical time from Adam to Noah in the flood. Adam to Noah are 10 generations, and they're broken down as follows. From Adam to Seth is 130 years, Genesis chapter 5, verse 3. From Seth to Enos is 105 years, Genesis chapter 5, verse 6. From Enos to Cana is 90 years, Genesis chapter 5, verse 9. Cana to Mahalalel, 70 years, Genesis chapter 5, verse 12. Mahalalel to Jared, 65 years, Genesis chapter 5, verse 15. Jared to Enoch, 162 years, Genesis chapter 5, verse 18. Enoch to Methuselah, 65 years, Genesis chapter 5, verse 21. Methuselah to Lamech, 187 years, Genesis chapter 5, verse 25. Lamech to Noah, 182 years, Genesis chapter 5, verses 28 to 29. And then from Noah to the flood, 600 years, Genesis chapter 7, verse 6. So if you add up all these years that were given here in Genesis chapter 5 and then the one verse in Genesis chapter 7 verse 6, you will come to 1,656 years. So there's basic universal agreement for those who do Bible chronology studies of this period of time. From Adam to Noah and the flood was 1,656 years. The difference in biblical chronology comes after this. And so we're going to continue because from Noah to Abraham is another 10 generations. And so it's broken down like this. From the flood to Arphaxad is 2 years, Genesis chapter 11, verse 10. Arphaxad to Salah, 35 years, Genesis chapter 11, verse 12. Salah to Eber, 30 years, Genesis chapter 11, verse 14. Eber to Peleg, 34 years, Genesis chapter 11, verse 16. Peleg to Ru, 30 years, Genesis chapter 11, verse 18. Ru to Serug, 32 years, Genesis chapter 11, verse 20. Serug to Nahor, 30 years, Genesis chapter 11, verse 22. Nahor to Terah, 29 years, Genesis chapter 11, verse 24. And then from Terah to Abraham, 70 years, Genesis chapter 11, verse 26. So we take this information from Genesis chapter 11, add it to the previous chronology from Adam to Noah in the flood, making the total amount of time from Adam to Abraham, we have 1,948 years. Now, the next thing that we're going to do is examine the time from Abraham to the children of Israel going into Egypt, and then the time they spent in Egypt before they crossed over into the Promised Land. So to begin to understand this, we're going to read from Genesis chapter 15, verses 13 and 14, where it says, He said to Abram, Know of a surety that your seed will be a stranger in a land that is not theirs, and will serve them, and they will afflict them 400 years. And also that nation whom they will serve will I judge. So it is a common perception in Christianity that the children of Israel spent 400 years in Egypt. But if we examine biblical texts closer, that is not possible. How might we understand that? Well, to begin with, we're going to look at the Art Scroll, which is an Orthodox Jewish published book to Genesis, which is Breshit, Volume 1, page 525, where it explains that the 400 years spoken of in the prophecy here in Genesis in chapter 15, verse 13, that the counting of the 400 years starts from the birth of Isaac. So it says, it was with the birth of Isaac 30 years after this covenant, meaning that Abraham was 70 at the time of the covenant, and he was 100 at Isaac's birth, that the 400-year calculation in this prophecy would begin from here. That is the birth of Isaac. And so now we are going to see that from what we're told in Genesis chapter 46, verse 8 and verse 11, that when Jacob's family went to Egypt, that Jacob went to Egypt, and one of his 12 sons, Levi, went to Egypt, and Levi had a son named Kohat, and he went to Egypt. So therefore, Jacob, Levi, and Kohat all went to Egypt. And then, in trying to examine more closely how long were the children of Israel in Egypt, we can see that Kohat, who went to Egypt, had a son named Amram. And Amram had a son named Moses. And Moses was 80 years old when the God of Israel used him to deliver the children of Israel out of Egypt. So we only have from Kohat to Amram to Moses plus 80 years. So we're not going to get 400 years looking at it that way. So looking at it in detail from the Art Scroll of Genesis, Volume 1, page 532, that Moses is the fourth generation from Levi who went to Egypt. The three generations involved in the Egyptian bondage are thus Kohat, Amram, and Moses. The fourth generation, that's the children of Moses, returned to the Promised Land as it was prophesied. In continuing and looking at how long the children of Israel were in Egypt, from the Art Scroll commentary to the book of Genesis or Breshit, Volume 1, page 527. It explains. Rashi, who is one of the most prominent rabbinical commentators on the Torah, who lived in the Middle Ages, explained the chronology as follows. The period of 400 years extends from Isaac's birth until the Exodus. This total is arrived at because Isaac was 60 years old when Jacob was born. Genesis chapter 25, verse 26. Jacob, as he himself stated in Genesis chapter 47, verse 9, was 130 years old when he went to Egypt, making a total of 190 years. They were actually in Egypt for 210 years, the numerical equivalent of the Hebrew word radu, which is spelled with a resh, which has a numerical value of 200, the dalet, a numerical value of 4, and a vav, numerical value of 6. So 200 plus 4 plus 6 is 210. That making 400 years altogether. Rashi goes on to explain that the verse cannot intend to suggest that they were actually in Egypt for 400 years because Kohat, who accompanied Jacob to Egypt, lived 130 years, Exodus chapter 6 verse 18, and his son Amram lived 137 years, Exodus chapter 6 verse 20. And Moses was 80 years old when the children of Israel left Egypt. That is Exodus chapter 7, verse 7. If you would only add the age of Kohat when he died, who went to Egypt, 130 years, and the age of his son Amram when he died, 137 years, plus the 80 years of Moses when the children of Israel left Egypt, that only totals 347 years. So they could not have been in Egypt for 400 years. The next slide is going to show you a little better an overview of this period of time. That Abraham was 70 years old when the covenant was made with him between the pieces, as outlined in Genesis chapter 15 verses 12 to 14. And from that time to the birth of Isaac, 30 years, Genesis chapter 21 verse 5. And then from the birth of Isaac to the Exodus, 400 years, broken down to it being the following. From Isaac to Jacob was 60 years, Genesis chapter 25 verse 26. From Jacob to going into Egypt, he was 130 years, Genesis chapter 47 verse 28. That leaves 210 years left. So another way of understanding this is from the birth of Abraham to when the children of Israel came out of Egypt was 500 years. So then we know that the children of Israel spent 40 years in the wilderness. Among other places, we're told this in Numbers chapter 32, verse 13. So now we are going to add up the years from the information we've shared with you so far to see how long was it from Adam to when the children of Israel went into the promised land. To summarize it, from Adam to the birth of Abraham is 1,948 years. From the birth of Abraham to when the covenant was made with him at the pieces in Genesis chapter 15 is 70 years. And then from when the covenant was made with Abraham between the pieces in Genesis 15 to the birth of Isaac, 30 years. From Isaac to Jacob, 60 years. From Jacob to going into Egypt, 130 years. From Egypt to the children of Israel coming out of Egypt, 210 years. They were in the wilderness for 40 years. So using this chronology, from Adam to when the children of Israel crossed into the promised land was 2,488 years. So next I'm going to share with you from an extra biblical book called the Book of Jubilees. And the Book of Jubilees is an attempt to classify the events that happened primarily in our Bibles in Genesis and Exodus and give each event a time reference in the context of a Jubilee period. And in the Book of Jubilees, a Jubilee is regarded as being 49 years before the cycle restarts. So in the Book of Jubilees, chapter 50, verse 4, it says, there are 49 Jubilees from the days of Adam until this day that they're referring to in the verse. And 1 week and 2 years. So how long is that? 49 Jubilees times 49 years plus 1 week, which is 7 years, in 2 years. So that comes to 2,410 years. And there are yet 40 years to come for learning the commandments of the Lord until they pass over into the land of Canaan, crossing the Jordan to the west. So what they're referring to here in Jubilees chapter 50 verse 4 happened according to this rendering of time. 2,410 years from Adam, and then they had 40 more years to the crossing the Jordan. In other words, in the book of Jubilees, they have it that from Adam to crossing into the promised land was 2,450 years. But if we remind ourselves of the chronology which we first gave in this teaching, that from Adam and Eve in the garden to the promised land, we came up with how we did it to be 2,488 years. But according to the book of Jubilees, from Adam and Eve in the garden to the promised land is 2,450 years. So the difference between these two viewpoints is 38 years. So there is a difference. There's not an exact agreement, but the difference is relatively small. So now we're going to continue on with the study from the children of Israel being in the wilderness for 40 years to the death of Joshua. We're told in Joshua chapter 14 verse 7 that Joshua was 40 years of age when he went to spy out the land. Then they spent 40 more years in the wilderness. And we're told in Joshua chapter 24 verse 29 that Joshua was 110 years old when he died. So from the crossing into the promised land to the death of Joshua is 30 years. From Joshua, we're going to look at the period of the rule of the judges. And so how we're going to look at it is the rule of the judges were chronological in time. There are some who do Bible studies who do not believe that these judges served chronologically. But we're going to first look at it chronologically. So the period of time under King Cushan-Rishathaim, as outlined in Judges chapter 3 verse 8, is 8 years. Under Othniel is 40 years. Judges chapter 3 verses 10-11. Under Eglon is 18 years. Judges chapter 3 verse 14. Under Ehud, 80 years. Judges chapter 3 verse 15 and verse 30. Under Jabin, 20 years. Judges chapter 4 verses 1 through 3. Under Deborah, 40 years. Judges chapter 4 verse 4. Judges chapter 5 verse 31. Under the Midianites, 7 years. Judges chapter 6 verse 1. Under Gideon, 40 years. Judges chapter 6 verse 7. Judges chapter 8 verse 28. Under Abimelech, 3 years. Judges chapter 8 verse 32 and Judges chapter 9 verse 22. Under Tola, 23 years. Judges chapter 10 verses 1 and 2. Continuing, under Yair, 22 years, Judges chapter 10 verse 3. Under the Ammonites, 18 years, Judges chapter 10 verses 5 through 8. Under Jephthah, 6 years, Judges chapter 12 verse 7. Under Ibzan, 7 years, Judges chapter 12 verses 8 and 9. Under Elon, 10 years, Judges chapter 12 verse 11. Under Abdon, 8 years, Judges chapter 12 verses 13 and 14. Under the Philistines, 40 years, Judges chapter 13 verse 1. Under Samson, 20 years, Judges chapter 16 verses 30 and 31. And finally, under Eli, which brings us to the prophet Samuel, 40 years. 1 Samuel chapter 4 verses 15 and 18. Now, if you add up the period of the judges under the assumption that all this information is chronological, from Judges to Samuel is 450 years. And we're told in Acts chapter 13 verse 20 that the period of time from Judges to Samuel was 450 years. And now after Samuel, what we're going to do is we're going to look at the period of the reign of the kings of Judah, beginning with King Saul, who ruled for 40 years, Acts chapter 13 verse 21. Under King David, 40 years, 1 Chronicles chapter 29 verses 26 and 27. Under King Solomon, 40 years, 1 Kings chapter 11 verses 42 and 43. Under King Rehoboam, 17 years, 1 Kings chapter 14 verse 21. Under King Abijam, 3 years, 1 Kings chapter 15 verses 1 and 2. Under King Asa, 41 years, 1 Kings chapter 15 verses 8 to 10. Under King Jehoshaphat, 25 years, 1 Kings chapter 22 verses 41 and 42. Under King Jehoram, 8 years, 2 Chronicles chapter 21 verse 5. Under King Ahaziah, 1 year, 2 Chronicles chapter 22 verses 1 and 2. Under Queen Athaliah, 6 years, 2 Chronicles chapter 22 verse 12. Under King Joash, 40 years, 2 Chronicles chapter 24 verse 1. Under King Amaziah, 29 years, 2 Chronicles chapter 25. Verse 1, under King Uzziah, 52 years, 2 Chronicles chapter 26, verse 3. Under King Jotham, 16 years, 2 Chronicles chapter 27, verse 1. Under King Ahaz, 16 years, 2 Chronicles chapter 28, verse 1. Under King Hezekiah, 29 years, 2 Chronicles chapter 29, verse 1. Under King Manasseh, 55 years, 2 Chronicles chapter 33, verse 1. Under King Ammon, 2 years, 2 Chronicles chapter 33, verse 21. Under King Josiah, 31 years, 2 Chronicles chapter 34, verse 1. Under King Joahaz, 3 months, 2 Chronicles chapter 36, verse 2. Then under King Jehoiakim, 11 years, 2 Chronicles chapter 36, verses 3 through 7. Under King Jehoiakim, 3 months, 2 Chronicles chapter 36, verse 9. And finally, under King Zedekiah, 11 years, 2 Chronicles chapter 36, verse 11. So if we add up the period of time of the rule of the kings of Judah, beginning with Saul to Zedekiah, and here we are examining their rule and reign chronologically, the total period of time of the rule of the kings of Judah is 513 years. Now, history tells us that the temple was destroyed and the Jews went into Babylonian captivity in the year 586 BC. So now what we're going to do is we're going to do the summary from Adam and Eve in the garden to the year 0. And using this chronology that we've just gone over with you, how long is it from Adam and Eve in the garden to the year 0? Now, history does not say that Yeshua was born in the year 0. We're just doing this for the sake of an understanding of an overview of time from Adam to the first century, from Adam to Yeshua, from Adam to the year 0. So from Adam to Abraham, 1,948 years. So from the birth of Abraham to the covenant made with Abraham between the pieces in Genesis chapter 15 is 70 years. From when the covenant was made with Abraham between the pieces in Genesis 15 to the birth of Isaac, 30 years. From Isaac to Jacob, 60 years. Jacob to going into Egypt, 130 years. From Egypt to the beginning of the Exodus, 210 years. The children of Israel spent 40 years in the wilderness. Then from Joshua to the beginning of the time period of the Judges, 30 years. From Judges to Samuel, 450 years. And then the years of the kings of Judah, 513 years. And now the date of the Babylonian captivity, 586 BC, which is going to the year 0. So using this chronology, from Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden to the first century, to the time of Yeshua, to the year 0, is 4,067 years. So am I trying to say that this chronology that I've just gone over with you is perfect and exact? And I can guarantee you that it was from Adam and Eve in the garden to the year 0 was 4,067 years? No, I cannot. I'm not trying to say that. I'm not trying to make that point. The point I'm trying to make is we can establish the principle that we have approximately, because there's a variance in doing biblical chronology, that from the time of Adam and Eve to the first century to the time of Yeshua to the year 0 is approximately 4,000 years of time. So because there's a variance in those who do biblical chronologies, I'm going to now give you an examination of time from Adam and Eve in the garden to the year 0. This time, first using the time from Adam and Eve to the children of Israel going into the promised land as being not 2,488 years, which is what it was in the chronology I've just gone over, but using the time given from the book of Jubilees, which is 2,450 years. And then take the remaining information that I gone over in the chronology that I gave you, which is from Joshua to Judges, 30 years, from Judges to Samuel, 450 years, the time of the kings of Judah, 513 years, and then the Babylonian captivity being in 586 BC. So doing it this way, we have closer to 4,000 years, that from Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden to the first century to the time of Yeshua to the year 0 would be 4,029 years. And so if we're doing biblical chronology, it would be understandable to ask the question, what year is it on the present Jewish calendar? If Yeshua came approximately 4,000 years from Adam and Eve in the garden, and we've gone 2,000 years from Yeshua and his ministry in the first century. So aren't we closer right now to the conclusion of 6,000 years of time? One would draw that conclusion from the information that I just provided. But yet, what year does it indicate in the present Jewish calendar? Well, in the present Jewish calendar, and I'm doing this teaching in 2019, and in the present Jewish calendar, it's 5,779 years. So how come in the present Jewish calendar, isn't it closer to 6,000 years? So that's what I'm going to go over next. How is it derived on the present Jewish calendar that we've only gone 5,779 years, in this being 2019? Well, I'm going to share with you from the book, The Gates of the Seasons, A Guide to the Jewish Year, put out by the Central Conference of American Rabbis. And explaining the Jewish calendar, on page 9 it says, "The Jewish tradition of counting years since the creation of the world has its roots in early Talmudic times, but it was not adopted as being authoritative until several centuries later. In biblical times, dates were often given as being 2 years before the earthquake, or the year of the death of King Uzziah, etc. In Talmudic times, we find instances of dating from the creation of the world, but doing so was adopted as the Jewish method only much later in response to Christian dating, that being given from Yeshua and his coming to the earth in the first century. It was in the 8th century that Christians began to date their documents generally as AD, which means in the year of our Lord. And so it shouldn't be surprising that in the 8th and 9th centuries, we find more and more Jewish documents dated, quote unquote, since the creation of the world. Obviously, to Jews, calculating dates based on the Christian counting in the year of our Lord, meaning referring to Yeshua, is not acceptable to Jews who don't believe in Yeshua as the Messiah. Nevertheless, it was not until the 12th century that the Jewish dating of since the creation of the world became more common and accepted by Jews universally. Jewish texts will often use such designations as BCE, which means before the Common or the Christian Era, or CE, the Christian Era, in order to avoid any dating related to Christianity. So in order to determine, based upon the present Jewish calendar, the Jewish year for any given civil year, or the date in the year of our Lord, the number 3,760 is added. Conversely, in order to find the civil year for a given Jewish year, 3,760 is subtracted. Of course, since the Jewish year changes with Rosh Hashanah, the number to work with from Rosh Hashanah to December the 31st is 3,761. So now I'm going to give you more specific information regarding how is it regarded that in the present Jewish calendar that it does not indicate that we're close to the conclusion of 6,000 years of time, but instead in 2019, it's 5,779 on the Jewish calendar. So I'm going to share with you from the Jewish Encyclopedia in the article Seder, Olam, Rabbah. So Seder in Hebrew is order, Olam is world, or Rabbah is great. So this work means the great order of the world. And it is a 2nd century Hebrew language chronology. Jewish authorities generally ascribe its authorship to have been written about the year 160 by the well-known Talmudist Yossi ben Halafta. On the strength of Rabbi Yochanan's statement, the Tana of the Seder Olam was Rabbi Yossi, Yebamot 82b, and Nida 46b in the Talmud. Many sayings of Rabbi Yossi's quoted in the Talmud are paralleled in Seder Olam. In the Babylonian Talmud, it is often referred to simply as Seder Olam, Shabbat 88a, Yebamot 82b, Nazir 5a, Megillah 11b, etc. Continuing from the article in the Jewish Encyclopedia, in its present form, Seder Olam Rabbah consists of 30 chapters, with each 10 chapters forming a section or a gate. It was probably also supplemented and edited at a later period. The work is a chronological record extending from Adam and Eve in the garden to the Bar Kokhba revolt by the Jews against the Romans in the year 135. That is to the reign of the Roman ruler Hadrian. It is believed that originally Seder Olam was more extensive and consisted of two parts, the second in which dealing with the post-Alexandrian Greek period. That part of the work has been lost, with the exception of a small fragment that was added by the copyists to the first part. However, many passages quoted in the Talmud are missing in the edition of Seder Olam, which has survived. It is quoted as Seder Olam by the more ancient biblical commentators, including Rashi. Starting in the 12th century, it began to be designated as Seder Olam Rabbah to distinguish it from a later, smaller work called Seder Olam Zuda. After dealing with the first 10 chapters with the chronology of the period from the creation of the world to the death of Moses, the writer proceeds to determine the dates of the events which occurred after the Israelites, led by Joshua, entered the Promised Land. In 1 Kings chapter 6 verse 1, it states that Solomon began to build the temple in Jerusalem in the 4th year of his reign, 480 years after the Exodus. That is, 440 years after the Israelites entered into the Promised Land. According to Seder Olam, the destruction of the first temple occurred after it had stood for 410 years, which would correspond to 3,338 years after the creation of the world. Then the Jews went into 70 years of Babylonian captivity. According to Seder Olam, the period of time of the second temple was 420 years when it was destroyed in the year 70 AD, that being in the year 3828 from Adam and Eve in the garden, or from the creation of the world. The 420 years of the second temple are divided into the following periods: 34 years of Persian rule while the temple stood, 180 years of Greek rule, 103 years of the Maccabees, and 103 years of the Herods. So, in order to put that in a chart, that is the purpose of this slide. And so this chart is according to the Jewish chronology in Seder Olam Rabbah, which corresponds to the present Jewish calendar. So from Adam to the flood was 1,656 years. From the flood to the birth of Isaac was 392 years, which would make the birth of Isaac in the year 2048. From the birth of Isaac to the Exodus, 400 years. That would be 2,448. They were in the wilderness for 40 years, so it's 2,488 years. Therefore, in the Jewish chronology, from Adam to the children of Israel crossing into the Promised Land is 2,488 years. That's the exact period of time that I presented in this teaching in the first part. So from what I presented, from Adam to the children of Israel going to the Promised Land, is exactly the same as the Jewish chronology. The difference from what I presented comes now after the children of Israel crossed into the Promised Land. So in the Jewish chronology, from the children of Israel crossing into the Promised Land to the building of the first temple by Solomon in the 4th year of his reign, 1 Kings chapter 6 verse 1, is 440 years. So that would be 2,928 years from creation. And then, given that the destruction of the first temple was in the year 586, that's another 410 years. That would correspond to 3,338 years from Adam and Eve in the garden. So then the Babylonian captivity was 70 years. So that would make it 3,408 years. Then to the destruction of the second temple in the year 70 by the Romans, an additional 420 years, which gives you a total of 3,828 years from Adam and Eve in the garden to the destruction of the second temple by the Romans in the year 70. So there is going to be over 150-year difference from the information I presented to you from the Jewish chronology. Why the difference? Now I'm going to share with you an article from the Wikipedia Encyclopedia to explain why the over 150-year difference. The current Hebrew calendar year numbering system counts years from the creation. It's been in use by the Jewish people for nearly 1,000 years. The year numbering system was adopted sometime before the year 165 CE or AD and it's based on the calculation of Rabbi Yossi ben Halafta during about 160 CE or AD in the book Seder Olam Rabbah. For example, the Jewish year for the destruction of the first temple has traditionally been given as 3,338 years from Adam and Eve in the garden, which would correspond to 421 or 422 BC. This corresponds to the secular historical year of 586 BC. Seder Olam Rabbah says that this period of time, that is, from the destruction of the first temple in 586 BC to the destruction of the second temple in 70 AD, is 490 years. Now, the Jewish chronology, that's 490 years. But if we take the secular time frame that the first temple was destroyed in the year 586, and the second temple in the year 70, how long is that? That's 586 plus 70. That is 656 years. And in Jewish chronology, they said the time from the destruction of the first temple to the second temple is 490 years. But how we understand the dates of history from a secular viewpoint, it's 656 years. The difference is 165 or 166 years. And so why is there a difference of 165 or 166 years? Because Seder Olam Rabbah says that there was 34 years during the time of the Persian rule while the temple stood. Talmudic sages say that there were 4 Persian Median kings: Darius I, Cyrus, Ahasuerus, and Darius II, spanning 52 years. Conventional or secular chronology, based on the works of Herodotus, a Greek historian, and inscriptions found at excavations of ancient Persian palaces, indicates that there was more than 10 Persian kings over a 207-year period, which would account for a difference of 165 years. So in other words, in the present Jewish chronology, they did not fully count the years of the Persian kings. That is why on the Jewish calendar, we're only at, in the year 2019, the year 5779, and not closer to the year 6000. So now, what I'm going to summarize in this understanding of time is we're going to combine first the information given in Seder Olam Rabbah plus the date in secular history of the Babylonian captivity, which is in 586. So first, the Jewish chronology of time is given in Seder Olam Rabbah. From Adam to the flood, 1,656 years. From the flood to the birth of Isaac, 392 years. From the birth of Isaac to the Exodus, 400 years. From the Exodus to the first temple, 480 years. From the first temple to its destruction, 410 years. And the first temple was destroyed in 586 BC. So we take that secular date now instead of the Jewish rendering from the destruction of the first temple. We take the secular date, 586 BC, and add it to the Jewish chronology from Adam to the destruction of the first temple, from Adam and Eve in the garden to the first century to the days of Yeshua to the year 0 is 3,924 years. So what we've covered so far in the teaching is I've given you a chronology of time in the simple rendering of the time without cross-examination of the information. And then secondly, we looked at the Jewish calendar and the Jewish understanding of time. And the third thing we're going to look at is a very prominent biblical chronology called the Ussher chronology. So what is the Ussher chronology? It was done by James Ussher. And who is he? He lived from January the 4th, 1581 to the 21st of March, 1656. He became a professor of theology in Dublin in 1621. He was the Church of Ireland's Archbishop of Armagh and primate of all Ireland between 1625 and 1656. In 1654, Ussher published a book entitled Annals of the World. It is a historical chronology from the ancient world until the destruction of the Second Temple by the Romans in the year 70. In this book, Ussher calculated the date of creation to be 4004 BC. As a result of his very detailed work, 4004 BC became the date that was most often used for those who put biblical charts in Bibles as the date of creation. And it is printed in many King James Bible editions after the year 1701. So Ussher calculated from the creation of the world to the birth of Yeshua, which he said happened in 4 BC, was exactly 4,000 years. Next, I'd like to share with you a graphical chart of the Ussher biblical chronology that may appear in some versions of the King James Bible. Then, next, I want to examine more closely the chronology of James Ussher, and in doing so, when we look at the next slide, we can see that in his chronology, from Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden to Noah in the flood is 1,656 years. This is the exact time that I presented in the chronology that I gave at the beginning of this teaching, and it is the exact time that is given in Seder, Olam, Rabbah in Jewish chronology. When we go to the next slide of Ussher's chronology, we're going to see where the first difference comes in the chronology study. Both in the chronology that I gave and in Seder, Olam, Rabbah, Jewish chronology, we have the birth of Abraham being 1,948 years from the creation of the heavens and the earth. However, in the Ussher chronology, he has Abraham being born 2,008 years from the creation of the heavens and the earth. This is a difference of 60 years. And based upon how you examine and interpret the information given in the scriptures regarding the birth of Abraham, one may conclude that his father Terah was 70 years old when Abraham was born, or possibly 130 years of age. And then another difference comes in wherein one may interpret that Abraham was 70 years of age when he first entered the land of Canaan, whereas in other views, Abraham was 75 years old when he entered Canaan. Therefore, in the Ussher chronology, from the creation of the heavens and the earth to the exodus from Egypt is 2,513 years. Wherein the chronology that I gave in this teaching, as well as the Seder, Olam, Rabbah, Jewish chronology, from the creation of the heavens and the earth to the children of Israel coming out of Egypt, was 2,448 years, a difference of 65 years. Continuing and looking at the Ussher chronology, from the exodus of the children of Israel out of Egypt to the start of Solomon building the first temple came about in the 480th year from the children of Israel coming out of Egypt. And then we have the rest of Solomon's reign, given that he reigned for 40 years. 1 Kings chapter 11, verse 42. And then based upon Ezekiel chapter 4, verses 4 through 6, Ezekiel was told to lay on his left side for 390 days, representing the northern kingdom, and a 390-year period. And that will take us to the southern kingdom, or the Jewish people, going into their final Babylonian captivity. Given that Ussher has the birth of Yeshua in 4 BC, therefore in his chronology, from the time of the creation of the heavens and the earth to the birth of Yeshua is exactly 4,000 years. So let's summarize the Ussher chronology in his 4,000-year time period from Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden to the birth of Yeshua. It is as follows. From Adam to the flood, 1,656 years. From the time of the flood to the birth of Abraham, 352 years. From the birth of Abraham to the covenant between the pieces in Genesis chapter 15, 75 years. From the covenant between the pieces in Genesis chapter 15 to the children of Israel coming out of Egypt, 430 years. From the children of Israel coming out of Egypt to Solomon building the first temple, 479 years. From the first temple to the end of Solomon's reign, another 38 years. And then from the time of Solomon to the birth of Yeshua in 4 BC, 970 years. Therefore, in the Ussher chronology, from the time of Adam and Eve in the garden to the birth of Yeshua is exactly 4,000 years. So now, since we've covered several chronologies, let's try to summarize what we've learned. The initial chronology, which I gave, which covered from Adam and Eve in the garden to the year 0, 4,067 years. Combining information in my chronology with the conclusion of the book of Jubilees, where they have from the time of Adam and Eve to the children of Israel crossing over into the promised land being 2,450 years, if you combine these two chronologies, from Adam and Eve in the garden to the year 0 is 4,029 years. Seder, Olam, Rabbah, or the chronology of Judaism, from Adam and Eve in the garden to the year 0, 3,760 years. If we combine the information in Seder, Olam, Rabbah to the time when the first temple was destroyed, according to the secular date of 586 BC, from the time of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden to the year 0 is 3,924 years. And finally, the Ussher chronology, which goes from Adam and Eve in the garden to when he has the birth of Yeshua in 4 BC, is 4,000 years. So once again, my purpose in sharing with you the various chronologies is not to determine which is right and which is wrong and try to make the claim that we know the exact number of years from Adam and Eve in the garden to the birth of Yeshua, but we gave you these chronologies just to simply verify and validate it is biblically legitimate to come to the conclusion from the time of Adam and Eve in the garden to the days of Yeshua in the first century is approximately 4,000 years. And we've gone 2,000 or so years from the time of Yeshua in the first century. So in the generation that we're living in, we are coming to the time frame of the conclusion of 6,000 years from Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden to the present time. We are awaiting the transition to that seventh day or 1,000 year period, which is often referred by the prophets as the day of the Lord. And this is what Peter was trying to communicate to us in 2 Peter chapter 3 verse 8, where he was quoting him or making a reference to Psalm chapter 90 verse 4, where he says in 2 Peter chapter 3 verse 8, "But beloved, be not ignorant of this one thing, that one day is with the Lord as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years as one day." Well, that's going to conclude part 1 of our teaching on the 7,000 year plan of the God of Israel. Stay with us for part 2.
Oh, I love your word.